Welcome to Transmediale Conversation Piece. My name is Florian Wüst. I'm the this year's film and video curator of Transmediale. And as you might have recognized already, this year it's a different edition to the ones we experienced before. It's not even officially called festival, it's really Transmediale Conversation Piece that tries to generate a different type of conversation around very precarious, pressing subject of contemporary life and society, but it also tries to somehow mess up the traditional or the classic disciplines. Conference there, exhibition over here, film screening in the cinema space. Talking of the film and video program, as some of you might know, Transmediale came out or developed out of a video festival. Next year it will be the 30th edition in 2017. So the film and video screenings always played a crucial role to this festival, as well now to the conversation piece. But this year we only have half of the film and video program down at the cinema space in Theatersaal. The other half went out here into the auditorium and into the hall, and mixes the projection of film and video with formats of talk, live intervention, performance, or partly conference, as tonight with Parallelograms of Steve Rowell, which had been playing here since 7 o'clock in a loop. It's a film installation with 2 additional screens and a pamphlet with a newly written text by Brian Holmes with the title Mirror, Window, Door, Aesthetics of the New Avant-Garde. Parallelograms is an experimental documentary film and mapping project aimed at representing architectural typologies in American politics and industries. Specifically, the project interrogates the landscape of dark money and influence in Washington, D.C. Steve Rowell is a research-based artist who works with still and moving images, sound, installation, maps, and spatial concepts. His transdisciplinary practice focuses on overlapping aspects of technology, perception, and culture, appropriating the methods of tools of the geographer as well as the archaeologist. Since 2001, he's been program manager at large at the Center for Land Use Interpretation. I'm here. Excuse me. Steve is currently based in LA. Before he's been living in Berlin, he also already participated at Transmediale. So we're very happy to have him back in town and here during the conversation piece. Brian Holmes, with whom he has been and had an ongoing conversation around parallelograms, and now for this premiere of the installation version of the project, as said, Brian contributed a new written essay, and please come forward and pick up those pamphlets we printed out on those 2 tables on the left and right side of the stage. Brian is an art critic, cultural theorist, and activist, particularly involved with the mapping of contemporary capitalism. He collaborated with political art groups such as Ne Pas Plier, Bureau d'études, Public Netbase, Architectura, and Macrolab. In Chicago, where he is now living, he's a member of the Compass Group and teaches at the University of Illinois. Brian not only came over here for Parallelograms, he also participates on Friday in the Panic Room session on post-digital anxiety and the Anxious to Share keynote session, both on Friday as said. But now I want to welcome on stage Brian Holmes and Steve Rowell. The floor is yours. Thanks so much for coming. They're going to converse for half an hour, and then we're going to open the conversation discussion to you, the audience. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Just quickly, I just want to thank everyone at Transmediale and Brian Holmes for being a part of this, and thank you all for coming. We're going to divide this up, I guess, into 4 sections, more or less. Do we want to explain that, or should we just dive in?
Let's dive in.
Let's dive in. And I've got notes, so I'll be looking at this thing. Don't think I'm texting, but reading.
Well, it's fantastic to be here, and particularly on the occasion of this film. I'm looking forward. We decided we would have a kind of exploratory conversation, and so I'm curious what the results will bring. There's a point in the film where it says, "Time is expired. Please try again." That's pretty much exactly the way I feel about radical art and culture since 2008. And so actually I changed a lot of what I do since then. I moved back to the United States to try again, to face what seemed to me like very different circumstances, and to attempt to come at it from new angles. And while living in Chicago for a relatively brief time, I was more or less neighbors with Steve, and we got to know each other, and that's where our collaboration has begun tonight. So for this project that leads to tonight. So anyway, Steve, I want to give the word to you and let us explain a little how you've been trying again these last years, huh?
No, that's a nice quote to pull from the film. There aren't too many quotes I would think that you could actually apply to something like this, but that would be the one, unless you're talking about ammunition or corn syrup or aerospace weaponry. But I wanted to quickly start off by explaining, I guess, the story behind the film. Sort of, what was the original idea, where it came from, and it goes back to what was mentioned earlier. Florian mentioned about me moving from Berlin back to America. So 2010, I moved back for reasons that are totally separate to this project, but I moved to Washington, D.C., which is very odd, and it was actually sort of like against our will. My partner and I moved there. It wasn't against our will, but it wasn't by choice, I should say. It was for work reasons, but it was important for this film because I moved from one of the cultural capitals of the world, Berlin, to a cultural wasteland, which is Washington, D.C., right? I mean, I think if anybody here has been there, unless you're in politics, you probably agree with that. I mean, as I was told again and again, there's one game in D.C., and that's politics, and that is the culture, and everything else, I think, takes the back seat to that quite a bit. So the reason that's important is because it fed this creative impulse I had to do something with my time there, right? My 1 year that I knew I'd be living in D.C., aside from other things, I wanted to focus on a D.C.-based project. And I found myself riding my bike around, walking around D.C. as much as possible, and feeling completely overwhelmed by the monumental architecture of the space. There's this federal layer, this sort of monumental core, as they call it, in D.C. The overwhelming architecture is all neoclassical. And then behind that, just off the National Mall, it's this layer of postmodern and modern architecture. It's just looming above, 10, 15 stories above the original sort of town of Washington, D.C. And those facades became this overwhelming sort of presence. And I found myself reliving these teenage fantasies of reading J.G. Ballard as I was navigating my way through this difficult and sort of haunted terrain, and feeling disoriented. And that word disoriented comes up again and again, and thinking about how I thought of this film, because I want the viewer, you all, to feel this disorientation that one would feel in a place like D.C., very disconnected from the game, from the politics that occur there. At the time, I was also reading Reinhold Martin's book, Organizational Complex, and that's important as well because that book's really about the aesthetics of the military-industrial complex through corporate architecture. And D.C.'s full of this stuff, so I began thinking of a project that dealt with that industry. But then it became so much larger when I realized that not only do those companies all have headquarters in D.C., but there's this entire other level of power and influence that's happening there on a daily basis, right? That committing these white-collar crimes day in and day out. And those are committed by institutions like think tanks, political action committees, or PACs, or super PACs, as maybe we can explain a little later what that means, trade associations, lobbyists, and lobbying agencies. There's also government offices for these corporations like the Koch brothers, ExxonMobil. Every major company has a relations office there to basically influence people in politics with their policies. But I mention that too because it's about the revolving door. And that term might not be, known that much outside of certain circles, but basically the revolving door is this way that politicians, after serving public service, are then drawn into private service, making exponentially more money than they did before when they were a congressman or congresswoman or senator, but that they still use those connections they had to basically, enrich themselves and their small, cabal, their small gatherings. And that is an important part of I think, what Brian's sort of reading into the project and explaining and articulating is this idea of the aesthetics of the film, the mirror, the window, and the door. There's also this fourth thing, the revolving door, that we could get into a little bit later, maybe. But yeah, I just wanted to sort of explain that and why the title Parallelograms. Because as I was filming it, and I'll discuss the aesthetics later, but you see these oblique angles. Those are intentional for a lot of reasons that I'll talk about. But it became very apparent to me that I was basically subjecting the viewer to a series of distorted parallelograms. But the parallelograms are more than just a geometric shape. They're actually sort of a window into this parallel world, and the parallel world is what exists, in places like DC or in Brussels. It's this parallel world of power and influence that's separate from our own existence. I don't know how many of you all people are in the 1%, but I'm not. And that parallel world that's the 1% world. And we managed to sort of breach that thin veil between our world and their world, I think, by finding out the locations on the map, of this terrain, and peering through the mirrors into the spaces themselves and locating them and literally picking up the phone and calling them. And again, I can explain why I chose to include only the outgoing message after business hours a little bit later on. But I just want to kind of explain a little bit of the story behind the film and the nature of the title.
Yeah. Well, what I discovered while looking closely at this film was that what it's about, clearly this is an analytical film. It analyzes an entire structure of power and influence in Washington, D.C., which is para-democratic. It exists in parallel to the formal structure of government, and yet it governs, What I discovered looking into that structure of power and influence and looking into its history is that it really is a vast answering machine itself. It answers the dissidents that arose in the United States in the late 60s and early 70s, which really frightened our upper classes. And in order to respond to that, there was a pretty famous analysis of that in a text called the Powell Memo, where a man who would become a Supreme Court justice shortly after that pointed to a new source of contestation in American society, which no longer came from the traditional labor movement or the communist parties or what were really the old suspects, but which came from a whole new area of society, which was the universities, the churches, the mass media. So in other words, it was coming from the mainstream of American society. And in order to answer that, the industrial and financial classes, what we now call the 1%, built up over a period of decades an entire institutional structure. And one of the things that seemed extremely interesting to me was that already by the 1980s, they had read Antonio Gramsci. They knew that power is conquered not simply by seizing the central offices of the state, but crucially by transforming the way that people think. And so they came up with a three-leveled strategy, saying that you have to infiltrate and transform the universities, where basic concepts are produced, that you then have to turn those basic concepts, that sort of primary research, into intellectual products, which are either through think tanks, and the most notorious of those is the Cato Institute, which you saw there, but also the Ayn Rand Foundation and so on. On the one hand, this sort of policy product, and on the other hand, a more really sectoral kind of expertise, which is the expertise that a company like Google or Booz Allen Hamilton or Lockheed Martin or the meat producers of the United States or the sugar industry, etc., produce for the government, which becomes legislation. Something, by the way, which has been happening in Europe since the European Union, since the rise of Brussels, something which has been documented here very well by the Corporate Europe Observatory. So what really brought this to people's awareness in a very stark way in the United States was the third level of strategic change that was brought about by this general broad conservative capitalist reaction to the 60s, and that was the creation of what are essentially new kinds of political advertising agencies. They're called political action committees, and now we call them super PACs, because since this famous Supreme Court decision of Citizens United, which is the sort of right-wing media group whose Washington office is portrayed in the actual first scene of this video. Since the decision, which we know as Citizens United, these super PACs are able to spend unlimited amounts of money on campaign advertising under the pretense that that constitutes free speech.
Because corporations are people too.
Yes, corporations are people too. And so we, the people, really became acutely aware. In fact, this was one of the main drivers for the Occupy movement, was the realization that our country was now nakedly an oligarchy. And so what you're seeing here, it really is a serial portrait of the sort of business residences of the oligarchy, and I would, you know, we can go deeper into that, and all the information that's on the screen and some of the references in the text would allow you to go deeper into that. But what we wanted to do was also talk about the aesthetic strategies for this sort of serial portrait that you've carried out.
Also, I should explain that the film can be standalone as the main film, but also the synced map videos are important to this installation because they provide that extra layer of information, right? They have the maps, the sites on a map, I should say, and then there's also keywords that act as clues or hints as to why I included those. And I selected about 300 locations in D.C. primarily, with a few scattered ones across the country when I was researching this, and then narrowed it down to 64 for the film. And 64 is a random number that just came from the editing process of wanting to decrease the film or limit the film to 32 minutes, 30 minutes, approximately half an hour, because that felt like the longest amount of time I could actually sort of hold someone in suspense without basically kind of trying their patience, right? I mean, it's a kind of a long list of these organizations. In some cases, a pretty brutal listing, you know, one after another. And there are these occasional tempo breaks and this rhythm that I'm establishing through the film as a way, I think, to hopefully create more of an enigma in the film, how I present the material, because it's not just a didactic film. Obviously, there's a lot of sound, there's a lot of sort of hints, and even some senses of humor that I try to convey in the messages that I've chosen, but also in the way that I'm sort of breaking for the location sound that you hear in the background of each shot. And I hope that comes through to some extent. I mean, a lot of the work I do is full of codes, and the codes aren't necessarily very clear to most people. But I think that the sync map videos do help present that in a way that not that doesn't overly befuddle you as a viewer, but actually encourages you to sort of look through that mirrored glass and peer into the window and actually take this a step further. And we'll talk a bit more about how, as artists or as sort of consumers of creative material, how we act as activists, like how we sort of can potentially act upon information that's being presented in a film, even in this way. Because for me, a dead end, film is pointless. There's no reason, I don't think, to make a work of art which is literally meant to be absorbed visually anymore. I think that there's a time and a place for that in the past, but I just can't imagine doing it myself. So, why the angles? Why the sort of oblique point of reference? While going through and thinking about how to make this film, I tried actually to film interiors. I tried actually going into lobbies of, say, American Crossroads, which is the biggest and the baddest of the super PACs out there. It's started by Karl Rove, that you may know from the Bush administration, the Cheney administration years, I should say. Turd Blossom is his nickname. So look that up, and you'll sort of get a good sense of what American Crossroads does. So, the first second I was in the lobby, I was instantly stopped by security. And forget about pulling out a camera, and there's just no way.
You can't walk in the door, let alone pull out a camera.
I mean, the security, the level of security in D.C. is parallel to none. I mean, it's just unbelievable what you have to go through just to, go in and out of buildings in that town. And there's bollards around every major structure to prevent suicide bombers from crashing the gates. I mean, it's a hyper-paranoid city. But also filming from the street. If you're on the sidewalk with a tripod in D.C., instantly, bam, security. There's Capitol Police. There's private security. There's NSA security that actually drives around the city, and you can tell who they are because they wear black balaclavas on their face to disguise themselves with sunglasses and baseball hats, and their cars are stealth black, completely black cop cars. Secret Service. I mean, the place is just crawling with cops, right? So I learned quickly, sort of like through trial and error, what you could and could not do. And also on a limited budget, I had to film and basically drive, shoot, drive, shoot, drive, shoot. It was a really, really sort of rapid approach, So over the course of 3 years, I would fly to D.C. after no longer living there, rent a car, drive around. This is part of the process, but I think it might be helpful for you to realize why I was filming this way and literally film out of the passenger seat of the car with these 400 millimeter lens poking out, And oftentimes I wore a black baseball cap and sunglasses in the event that anybody would think I was a spy or someone that, knew what he was doing. They would just not harass me, and I wasn't stopped once. So it worked. And I mean, I had people that were so freaked out by my presence, they would just turn around and walk away. Even police would just move their cars around and let me park illegally to get the shot that I needed, So it was really pretty. I mean, it was actually kind of challenging, but ended up being this pleasurable thing that I ended up sort of doing as a role playing. Excuse me, as a citizen spy, right? And the oblique angles beyond just the practical, of filming, but it actually I'm doing this intentionally because I want to be peering, up basically from the ground up, and I want to be able to. I'm cutting out the ground in most of these shots to disembody the viewer, and I'm using the disembodied voice of these institutional outgoing messages intentionally because you're never going to get any of them to agree to use their voices. They're not going to want to be interviewed. The NRA, the National Rifle Association, sure as hell is not going to want to have someone like me do a formal interview over the phone. And also, how would that play into the concept of the film? It's about disorientation and about disembodiment. It's also the only legal way I can actually use their voices because an outgoing message is like a billboard. It's like an advertisement in public space, right? You can actually legally record that and use it without permission. It's a weird loophole. And this is a city full of weird loopholes, so I had to exploit that one. But it's also about the uncanny, It's like again, going back to my own personal experience of being in this haunted realm for 1 year, it was my way of wanting to sort of underscore that uncanniness and peering up, looking at the tops of buildings as much as possible, looking at the ceilings versus, people, looking down in offices, you would actually get people working. And I really wanted to try to avoid that. I wanted to have a depopulated DC as much as possible. I mean, the place is teeming with people during the day, but at 5 o'clock, it empties out. I mean, it really becomes a ghost town down there. And I live next to the FBI building 2 blocks from the National Mall in downtown, and so it was a ghost town at nighttime. And so that depopulated city is what I was hoping to convey in this film. And then the last thing I guess I should say about the aesthetics of how I shot it is, looking up at the tops of buildings, you see a lot of flags. There's flags all over America, and it's one of the things that living here I realize I'd sort of gotten so accustomed to that. I grew up in America, and I grew up in Texas, and so you'd see Texas flags and American flags everywhere, and I just became numb to those images, those kind of like patriotic symbols, right? But then I moved here and realized that national flags are kind of rare in most countries. You don't see them everywhere, but in DC especially, they're on top of almost every building. And I really wanted to like overload the viewer with that visual presence of that flag, in the hopes that it would actually convey what's happening now, which is this new hyper-nationalism that's occurring in America. And it's actually this weird blend of anarchy and libertarianism which is occurring. And they've actually coined this term, autochist, which is a combination of like autonomous and anarchist within certain sort of circles, like the Koch brothers and other extremely privileged sons of wealthy fathers in the industries there, is they've actually played this idea of like becoming autonomous anarchists because they want to completely undermine the government, but at the same time claim this patriotic pride. So it's a very twisted reality that Brian and I have been soaking in for quite some time here. But maybe we should, segue into sort of the politics now of what this film can represent.
I don't know. You should know that for a while, what we call libertarians, they used to simply call themselves anarcho-capitalists until they decided that the public couldn't handle that. So they used a softer term, libertarian. Something I find really interesting, and which is a politics of the aesthetic, is that this film actually, compared to, I would say, lots of your work with the Center for Land Use Interpretation, this is a highly aestheticized film. It really concentrates a tremendous amount on camera movements, on the play of reflections, on this sort of, there are multiple scenes that include reflections of the clouds in the mirrors. There's a whole sort of rhythmic composition of the editing that makes it a very, a very sophisticated aesthetic for such a strictly conceptual approach. It marries the two. And what I find really fascinating is that it does so right in the realm of the mirrored facade, which is really the place, the site, the architectural reality where what we used to call postmodernism was defined. The most memorably by the cultural critic Frederick Jameson, writing about the mirrored facade of a place called the Bonaventure Hotel in Los Angeles. And what Jameson was really getting at, and what dominated that period, and I think it continued to dominate all the way up until 2008 perhaps, was a sense of a disorientation and an inability to locate yourself so complete that what the experience of the subject really becomes is the experience, the schizophrenic experience of a self sort of rended to bits, torn into shards by an endless hall of mirrors, which is really what architecture had become. And what's interesting is that the film could easily have replicated that aesthetic, have magnified that aesthetic, and perhaps given it yet more uncanny and threatening undertones. But instead, I think what the piece actually does is enter that realm, which is the realm of the mirror, and then through a kind of discipline, which also involves the informational mapping that's associated with the film, actually turn that experience of disorientation into one of establishing a set of procedures for confronting the results of this 30-year program, which has now totally transformed, I think, not only American society, but global society, and which really requires of us, at a moment of more or less desperation, a very different approach than previous radical media makers have adopted, because it requires responding to their response. And their response has been so sophisticated, so far-reaching, and also has received so much investment that it can no longer really be laughed at in the way that we used to do, satirized and exploded through a kind of excess of fantasy and of gesture, which are all phrases that characterize the kind of things that I used to be involved in, I would say, up to the attempts, which were serious, but I'm afraid to say which failed to ignite, mass sort of more or less spontaneous kind of street revolts, I think that what we realize is that we really do need a transformation of the understanding that one can have of what a vanguard is and who that vanguard is, what such a vanguard could be composed of. And I find it quite interesting and quite encouraging that one of the attempts to do that should, in Steve's case and in the case of this film, take place in the exact sort of framework in which postmodern disorientation was defined. What's happening here, I think, is that the experience of the mirror, rather than stopping short, is actually being repurposed to generate a kind of aesthetic, affective energy that transforms the mirror into a window and allows you not just to see the fragments of yourself, but rather to see the connections between the multiple agencies that compose the world that has largely produced your own self.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're looking at the actual sites that represent this existential threat to the planet, I think. I mean, on many levels. This one in particular, perfect timing, this Center for Competitive Enterprise. Right, they, sorry, these names really get mashed up in my brain, but they're one of the lead agencies or lead institutions which funds climate change denial. So, funding scientists to basically undermine the common knowledge that we have caused climate change. And I've done a lot of work in the last 10 years about the Anthropocene. I mean, even before the term was sort of like brought into the art world, I've been sort of dealing with that with the work I do at the Center for Land Use Interpretation. It's all about geomorphology, right? Anthropogeomorphology is the term that Matt Coolidge coined some years ago to reference human-altered Earth, surface of the Earth, right? So the accelerated geomorphology. So looking at the agents of that change, that sort of intentional climate change, has been basically, defunded or has been flipped, inverted by these institutions. And that existential threat is important to acknowledge, because that's the thing that I think everybody needs to take seriously. And I think as artists, activists, writers, whatever in the cultural realm, to not do something in that, to not focus on that, to not pay attention to that and act upon it, I think is irresponsible to some extent. I mean, I've actually gone so far as to say that is there any real, or to question, is there any real reason to do abstract work anymore that's purely abstract? I mean, what exactly, how is that functional in any way? And maybe art doesn't have to be functional, and I'm sure we could argue about that forever, but I think that there's an urgency that a lot of us are feeling, and to turn our back on that function is irresponsible. And I think that that's where, the additional layer of information that these maps and that the text provides is that, again, it really is designed to compel at least a small percentage of the viewers to take that one step further and do some of the additional layers of research on their own. And there are links that I'll be putting up on my own website that each of these sites will have hyperlinks to some of these organizations that are dedicated to this expose, right? There's the Center for Responsive Politics, there's the Center for Media and Democracy, Sunlight Foundation, Maplight Foundation. These are all nonprofits that are dedicated to sort of revealing what some of these other nonprofits are doing, and many of them are actually headquartered in DC, so proximity is important, again, for what they're doing. But I really, do hope that some people do take this film seriously as a sort of call to action, as it were. because, I mean, time is nigh. I mean, we're in the middle of this insane presidential election right now in America. I'm sure everybody knows and is as sick of it as we are. But it can't go on like this. We can't have 2-year cycles anymore, you know? It's completely disruptive, and it's also completely humiliating as an American to see what's happening with the political system. And maybe we should think about how this can sort of, how this film can be read on a global level, or how films like this can be sort of useful to people that are not in America, that can't vote, you know.
Well, actually, Steve clued me into a film which is called Business Brussels, that's right?
The Brussels Business, I think.
Yeah, Brussels Business, which is really made about the Corporate Europe Observatory, and it really shows you this kind of structure of power and influence in Brussels, and the degree to which that has really reorganized Europe over the last 20 years is now very obvious, again, since 2008. I mean, this is something, of course, that people in this room have been working on for a long time. I mean, I myself collaborated with Bureau d'Etudes back in 2002 on a map which was called European Norms of World Construction, you know? But what has happened between 2002 and now is that we've seen the consequences of the world that these forces have produced, whether in Europe, in the European Union, or in the United States, where those consequences were perhaps more obvious, you know, for a longer time. And I think that really leads to a question about how to approach what the things that we do and that we will continue doing. I mean, the people who are gathered here, you know, are involved in electronic media, in various forms of art, in activism, and also in critique, you know. And how do all those things fit together, I think, is a tremendous question. Before, this idea just occurred to me, before we were talking about, you know, 3 levels of transformation: the university, the sort of world of think tanks and lobbies, and finally public relations. But I thought of 3 other levels, which is first the level of the aesthetic, the raw aesthetic, which I think is really the level of the mirror. It's the level where the self explores its own potentials. This is really the heart of the aesthetic experience. I think the aesthetic experience always presents this kind of narcissistic, fascinating, mirror-like entrancement, and this video really does that very, very strongly. Then there's a level of critical analysis, which is what I associate with transparency, you know, with the enlightenment, with the exercise of critical reason, with the window, you know, and of course the informational layer that's associated with this work is definitely involved with that. It's involved with creating a window where there wasn't one before. But the third level is really the level of, it's the possibility of the door. It's the possibility of being able to do something different. And I think that doing something different in our period now requires an organizational capacity that has not been explored by left-oriented vanguards for a long time. I think that's something that's extremely interesting. What's going on in the United States today is that there is an increasing awareness of the degree to which the adversary has been organized for a long time. And Steve would not have been able to make this film without drawing on resources produced by different organizations such as sourcewatch.org or opensecrets.org and other organizations which actually have their bureaus in Washington as well.
Yeah, those are the URLs for the centers that I mentioned earlier. It's just what they use for their URL, but there'll be links to all those on the website as well.
Yeah, and they're mentioned in the essay too, and it's really interesting to pursue them. But the question that we want to ask you is how to pursue that, because we live in the United States and we're necessarily obsessed, fascinated, haunted, and threatened by what happens in the United States. But it's very clear that the oligarchical condition of society is worldwide, you know, and the capacity for you know, what we in the U.S. call dark money to change one's own conditions of life is very, very clear since 2008. So I think that there's really a question of what can artists do? What can critical intellectuals do? What can hackers do? And what can political activists do? I don't think they do the same thing. But I think what's interesting is the possibilities of articulation between what people do. I think the sort of organizational form that is emerging, it does have a kind of vanguard figure, and I think that figure is really demonstrated pretty well here as the citizen spy. And so what can this figure in its multiple guises, you know, whether it's the artist, whether it's the hacker, whether it's the critical intellectual or the activist, really do, and how to pass the ball from one person to the next rather than believing sort of naively that you can concentrate the key to a solution in a single type of gesture, a single type of activity. I think there is where the real challenge lies for the upcoming years. And I think it is already resulting in very different kinds of figures than the ones that we had been accustomed to in the 90s and in the early 2000s.
Yeah, no, radical difference. But I think we're up for questions now. So perfect timing.
Yeah, thanks so much for this very insightful conversation of the two of you. To open up conversation, please look here. We have two micro stands on both sides, so that's where you can speak up. So I've been very curious, reading your pamphlet, and Brian, about this notion of the citizen spy. So now you coined it again, which is that then the new artist or activist that is really empowering himself to transform knowledge into political power. So there you see, let's say, the way out. As you said, we are in this frozen logic. We are in that situation where the system of free enterprise has been striking back massively after the 1960s, where social movements for a moment could take over, or at a moment where, let's say, also the peak of social welfare, of redistribution already was on decline, I would say, or talking about Europe here. So maybe you can expand a little bit on your idea of the citizen spy and how you relate that to the relationship of political power and a different type of knowledge and making that accessible.
Yeah, clearly what's provocative in that phrase and what's new is not the spy aspect. I mean, every, dissident, every radical has acted as a spy forever, It's the citizen aspect that's provocative. I mean, coming from a far left sort of origins and basic, habitus, it's how do you make the necessary action of breaking the law, of peering through those closed barriers that you're not supposed to see through, and ultimately of opening those doors that your hands were never supposed to touch, how do you make that legitimate? And how do you make it legitimate in a time of, like ours, which is a time possessed by fear, which is a time really that's increasingly dominated by the temptation of a radical turn to the right, a sort of becoming fascist atmosphere that really pervades not only Europe, where it has become so obvious, but also the United States. I think really throughout the world, because of fear, we have this. In the face of that, I think that the kind of responses that we're looking for now have to be so broad that they require a different kind of legitimacy, and they require what has perhaps formerly been considered impossible, and that is that the exploits of, say, a hacker become legitimate. Now, this to some degree is what happened with Edward Snowden, before that with WikiLeaks, and it is a real force in society and not simply the projection of a critic, And the reason it's happening is that really what that vast answering machine that the right created did not only answer the dissidents of the 60s, it answered the long construction of the welfare state, of the social state, beginning in our case in the 1930s, and definitely being built up on as a response to the conditions of World War II, you know. And that's what they're obsessed with in our country anyway. That's what the right is obsessed with, is a Roosevelt, if you will, not Johnson, huh? So this is a gigantic historical struggle, and because it is so gigantic, its terms have become very different than the ones that really dominated, at least in my mind, in the long, long wake of 1968 exactly. What's now happened is a kind of existential threat, that means a threat of death, for the vast, vast construction of the social state. And that has to do also with the unleashing of the power of what is now very clearly an oligarchy, also in the eyes of serious social science, and not just in the rhetoric of those who would denounce a few people. And so I think that this paradoxical figure of the citizen spy, it's paradoxical both for the left and for the mainstream, for different reasons. For the left, because of the notion of citizenship; for the mainstream, of course, because of the notion of spy, the notion of the exploit, of the hack, of direct action, and so on. And that's what I was really trying to get at with the concept of or the image, really, of the figure of the citizen spy.
Please use those microphones, and maybe there's answers to the question Brian had put to us.
Over here, maybe?
Hi. Hi, my name is Maya. I just wanted to make more of a comment than a question, really, about the notion of the citizen spy, and to talk about a project that's actually kind of evolved from here in Berlin and was talked about at the recent Chaos Congress in Hamburg in December. It's called IC Watch, Intelligence Community Watch, and it's by a young group of technologists and hackers who are actually very comfortable with the sort of language and the tools of social media. And what IC Watch really is just scraped LinkedIn profiles of people who work in the intelligence community, who work with the NSA. And because, you know, people who work at the NSA are also just people who need to be on social media and look for jobs and things. And it's a fascinating living archive investigation in real time of who's actually part of that community. And it's a very different notion than the kind of Edward Snowden kind of idea of, you know, the citizen spy. And it's kind of using the tools, technologies, and information that's floating around us all the time. And
so it's IC Spy?
IC Watch. Sorry.
IC Watch.
I think it's IC Watch, Intelligence Community Watch, and it's a group of young Americans, actually. I think most of them are Americans in Berlin. So I think that kind of introduces an interesting notion of the citizen spy.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah.
Thanks for mentioning that. I mean, I've done a lot of projects about security and surveillance over the years too. And 2007, I began investigating a bunch of sites in Europe that were sort of extensions of American military power. So I began photographing places, mostly in England, where there's all these places infested with American bases. Menwith Hill is the biggest spy base on the planet outside of the NSA's main headquarters. And I actually got into Menwith Hill legally. They actually accepted my sort of endless phone calls and let me come onto the base. But I mention that because, you know, over the years, I've also managed to sort of befriend people in that community, weirdly, mostly people that have retired. We used to work at Menwith Hill in the 60s and 70s. I worked at Bad Aibling, which was a similar base down near Munich. That was apparently now switched hands, and now the German Secret Service is running the radomes there. But I've kind of befriended these people through Facebook, and have access now to their photographs of their sort of golden years. You know, their sort of glory years when they were working for these agencies. And it's amazing how they publish this, how they put stuff online, how they pose, or their kids when they were in high school, on the base high school, would upload photographs of them playing Metallica in their dormitories in the 1980s and 90s, or just, you know, their drunken parties at the base PX. And all that stuff is in the public realm now, you know. So I've actually managed to collect this huge gallery and this strange view into that world. And I'm not sure if it's going to ever become something which is like formalized, but it's a curious sort of way into this black world, right? This sort of opaque space. But I think as a citizen spy, you sort of learn these strange skills, a DIY style. You're sort of like gradually piecing things together to sort of learn how to basically, you know, enable yourself with tradecraft, as they call it, right?
Thank you for triggering this really great conversation. It's making me think that, and I appreciated how you describe how, you know, abstract art or art that's not functional at this moment or is not tactical is kind of like it's out of its purpose. It can't enact something that would help this situation. So I just wanted to also ask, by just using our forms, like a media form or film or whatever, just to expose the problem, kind of haunts us even further if it doesn't somehow trigger that we get involved in some kind of embodied form of civil disobedience, perhaps. So like, I've been trying to write about this often, about how we need to formulate some kind of arts and praxis that's more embodied to resist the kinds of things where we're being captured in the spectacle as the analysis exists. To create forms that resist, that we're not going deeper into like the cybernetic regime, for example. And I think Snowden, as fantastic as that is to put all of that on the table and reveal, it's almost depressing that there's not enough action around what we've learned. And so what sort of arts and praxis, physical forms could we think about, perhaps, if that triggers some ideas to feedback on? Thank you.
Thanks, yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a way to answer that quickly, but I mean, the reason why I chose this particular format, this film, because it seemed like the most efficient way to sort of compress that landscape into a 30-minute temporal experience, you know, because the work is spatial and temporal at the same time. And it was the most efficient way to sort of include the audio, to include the hidden codes, and then with the map layer, include the actual information, which is providing as links. But I'm sure there are, you know, many ways that people are acting upon sort of what we've learned from, say, the Snowden revelations or even WikiLeaks, that are completely experimental and completely new and in development. I mean, in a lot of ways, that's kind of what transmediale has represented for a long time, and that's kind of why I was attracted to these festivals years ago, even before I moved here and began coming. So it's one giant laboratory.
Yeah. I mean, the key word of the avant-garde has always been act, you know. It's definitely about act. The question is on which level, you know, on which levels and with whom. And I think the possibility for innovation really lies there. Is it possible to really touch off and sustain larger and more coordinated types of refusal of interference than we have seen so far? I mean, the Occupy movement wasn't a failure by any yardstick that one had, except the yardstick of the problem that we now confront. And by that yardstick, it really was a failure. You know, I mean, I hate to say that about things and people that I love, you know. I think it's also every failure is a place from which you begin, and I think that's what's really, really interesting in the present, you know, is that there's a you take a deep breath, you know, you recover, you pick yourself up, and you think, well, having taken the old strategy to that extreme, it's time for a new strategy.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to take you three there, and then that would be it, yeah.
Sure. So I work in suburban California, and my reaction to this piece is this is just painfully ubiquitous for pretty much all office workers in the States. I know a lot of this is centered around DC, or this is all based in DC. So to what extent did the ubiquity of this architecture play into your film?
Oh, yeah, Banality of Evil, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is kind of where, you know, the realization of that aesthetic, that sort of corporate reality, reveals the hidden truths is more interesting, that it is banal, I think, right? I mean, there's this sort of, I've always had an appreciation for the vernacular, right? This sort of, especially the American vernacular, the sort of like amateur, architecture of the U.S. But when you see this sort of like hyper slick but banal equivalent, there's not much difference. But it did play into sort of what I was looking for, and I played with the idea of filming at different sites, like the RAND Corporation, one of the bigger think tanks in America, is actually headquartered in Santa Monica, California. It's not in D.C., but the idea was to really, really focus on the Beltway because I wanted that density to become apparent. And I felt that if I were to start doing a national version of the film, which would be, feature length easily, it would lose some of that intensity. But the architecture, the banality, it's all, it's actually what I was kind of hoping for. There are some extreme examples. The Cato Institute is like a building within a building, but it's because they have like a blast-proof layer probably on the outside. So I guess it's a functional banality.
Thanks.
Okay, please.
First, I'd just like to thank you for the film and for your words tonight. I consider this to be something like a teach-in, maybe my first. So thank you for that. I want to mention something that, and maybe I'm standing up tonight because I got caught off guard a few years ago here at the Transmediale Festival and the McLuhan lecture, which was held at the Canadian Botschaft, the Canadian Embassy. And at that lecture, the gentleman who spoke, whose name I don't remember, so I can't mention, claimed that freedom was baked into the internet.
Baked into it?
Yeah, baked into it. So all you had to do was go on the internet and use those tools of blogging and coding to become free. And he said this as we sat a few meters away from the site, the former site of the Berlin Wall. And for years, I knew he was wrong. And as I looked out the window, I thought to myself, this guy is effing wrong. And this was before NSA, before Snowden. Okay? And he's also a corporate spokesman for the powers that you are talking about tonight. Maybe he works for Google. Don't remember. So anyway, he talked about the maker community, and we all want to be makers. Do not be lulled by this term about coding and blogging, because I believe we're being, as you, I believe, would agree, we're being lulled to sleep by our devices. And we can see it every day as we all stare into the vast abyss of these cell phones. So ultimately, it's called social media, but you're alone when you're doing that. And you're just participating in a conversation which has been generated for you to be distracted from all the powers that be that you've exposed behind the windows. It's a narcissistic trap that we've been lulled into. So I ask those here, as this is about a conversation, to talk to each other and take action and resist and don't sign up, because the medium is the message here. And the message, the medium, has been absconded by the corporate powers that be, by the nation states that have put this in place. And I don't know if the giggling to my right is because in agreement, but there is a lot of fear, and the fear is turned into narcissism. It's a cage, much like Weber's cage. So thanks very much for your words tonight and for giving me a little time at the microphone.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more? She's been standing. Do we have time for one more? Is that cool? Yes. Sorry.
Feel a bit... Not sure I can follow that, but my question is slightly less informed. I'm not the best at this subject. But how do you feel about new developments that are happening in the DC area? I know Richard Rogers are building a new spy museum for Milk Malts at the moment there.
Sorry, who's building a new spy museum?
Richard Rogers,
Yeah.
the British architect. How do you want to see DC develop?
That's a great question. I don't know. I mean, I should point out that DC has been booming ever since the 2008 recession, right? Like when the bottom fell out, who benefited, you know? Washington, D.C., and the 2 or 3, the wealthiest counties in America are the 2 counties in Virginia that flank D.C. So it's a money funnel, you know? So the pains and woes of everyone else basically benefits those select few, those contractors. And as a result, it's like an urban planning explosion. I mean, it's just a nightmare of condo high-rises, architecture exploding all over the place. So I'm not sure if I can offer like a solution to an extremely problematic city. I'm not an urban planner or an architect, but I just know that living there, I found it to be one of the most unfriendly spaces to pedestrian, the cyclist, you know, to the citizen, to the individual. I mean, even to a driver. It's probably one of the worst. Actually, it is rated the worst traffic in America, and I live in LA, so it's slightly worse than LA, which is terrible. So it's like an anti-human city in many ways, right? And I would like to see there be some developments to where those select few neighborhoods that have existed for decades can possibly, you know, survive the onslaught, because there are these great little nested neighborhoods, you know, that are being completely pushed out. And Red Line District, basically, I mean, it's an entirely segregated city. You can look at these maps, and it's divided along Rock Creek Park, and then further out, and these completely destroyed neighborhoods are the ones that are African American, largely Hispanic, somewhat, and they're completely being overdeveloped, you know, gentrified and sort of gobbled up by this cancer, basically. And there are organizations that are trying to retain some of those neighborhoods. And I've got a few friends, one of which Amanda Huron is thanked in this film. She's a geographer teaching at George Washington University, and she's actively one of these people that is trying to, you know, retain these areas and fight development. I mean, this is sort of going on all over the world. I mean, you know, places in the UK, US, Germany, Berlin has been sort of victim to this, right, for many years now.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. I would like to wrap up, and what I appreciate that you emphasized, I mean, that's about Washington, D.C., it's about American or U.S. politics. We can, that's a global problem. This map can be drawn in Berlin, in Brussels, especially in London, and the system is very smart. It's not only about the influence of politics, it's on other levels too. So especially in Brussels, that's the problem that they're not even bother about politicians anymore. They're there for 4 years, and then somebody else is reelected, and you have to start over. They go directly to the functionaries who actually are designing the texts for the laws, and that's much more efficient, and you establish relationships there. So that's a huge topic. We are there to open this year's transmediale conversation piece with the premiere of your installation, Parallelograms. I'm really happy to have you here. You are both present for some more days. Brian is well on this stage here. Now we're gonna dim down the lights again, bring up the sound, and until midnight you can keep seeing Parallelograms. And please don't hesitate to take the pamphlets with you with Brian's brand new essay. Thanks so much to you both.
Thanks, Florian. Yes.